Okay, welcome everybody to another episode of Needs Some Introduction. Today we are discussing the sixth episode, actually discussing the sixth episode of the second season of Severance, an episode called Attila. Sona, before we get going, I had just mentioned to everybody, really only one call to action. We're trying to get to 100 subscribers on YouTube. If we get there, we'll have a video episode of some kind, probably just one of these conversations, but recorded with our lovely faces presented to the public. If you would like to help us get to that goal, then remember to subscribe. By the way, in my most recent conversation with Darren, the other co-host, he mentioned that he had trouble finding the podcast. So I actually went on YouTube and searched for it. And if you look, Need Some Introduction podcast, whatever, it doesn't actually come up that easily. So first of all, there's a link in the show notes. If you haven't found it, if you've been looking for it, it's there in all the most recent episodes. Check the show notes. And second of all, if you do need some introduction as a single word, you'll find us pretty readily. And this also speaks to the fact of why I'm even doing this exercise of trying to get more YouTube subscribers. There's a huge audience on YouTube, obviously. I mean, until you get to a certain threshold, you do not pop up on any kind of Google or YouTube algorithm or even search results. It's like very difficult to get any kind of traction. So I'm trying to grease the wheels, and it seems to be happening. We are getting more listeners there. Obviously, all you folks who have subscribed are helping get us in front of more eyeballs. And that's really the goal of this whole thing. So I'm not saying you should listen to the podcast there unless you really want to, or if you have the YouTube podcast player, which apparently is a new app they have now, replacing their old Google Podcasts app. That's an option, but just subscribe or have your friends subscribe to help us get to that threshold, because it helps get the podcast in front of more people. Oh, and by the way, I mentioned I would give you a count and how we're progressing. We're up to 39 subscribers. Last time I looked this morning, 39. So
nice.
So we're getting there, almost halfway there. The next thing I wanted to mention to you, Sona, I have a minor recommendation. There's a series that premiered this week on Netflix called 0 Day. Have you seen any ads for this?
I haven't. Tell me more.
So it's a political thriller. It's about a 0 day attack where basically all technology gets zeroed out, gets turned off, electricity, everything gets disrupted. A initial attack that lasts just a few minutes, and there's a warning that this is going to happen again for a more prolonged period of time. And then Robert De Niro, this is his first TV series, is a former president who is put in charge by the current president to investigate and try to find out what's going on. The current president is played by Angela Bassett. This is a stacked cast, Sona. So Robert De Niro, Jesse Plemons, Lizzie Kaplan, Connie Britton, Joan Allen, Bill Camp, Dan Stevens, Matthew Modine, Angela Bassett, and others. It's like an incredibly stacked cast.
Wow.
Very curious about this, another conspiracy thriller, so many conspiracy thrillers in the past few months. And the reviews have been mostly negative, or I guess 50-50 probably. From the sampling of the reviews I looked at, it's because they complain about the political metaphor in the show, that the show doesn't really take a political stance on what it's representing. I saw the first few episodes. I haven't finished the series yet, but I've seen most of it. And I have to say, especially for Netflix, where I find most of these shows really tedious, I was really drawn into this show. De Niro is still very captivating on camera. Everybody's doing a really great job, like selling scenes that maybe wouldn't work, but they're doing a really good job of pulling that off. And maybe the mystery itself won't be that satisfactory in the end. But as far as a political metaphor, I actually thought this was really interesting, that as you're watching the show, it could be left-wing extremists. It could be right-wing extremists. It could be the Russians. It could be someone is starting to get demented and is maybe seeing patterns where those patterns don't exist. So it could be some element of that, like maybe just being paranoid makes you believe things that aren't necessarily true. And I guess that's a complaint that some critics have had. And once again, I don't even know how the mystery is going to resolve. But I actually thought this was very interesting. It's almost warning us that, being overly paranoid and not listening to each other or listening to these voices that are overtly in the show staked in creating divisions so that they can, either win an election or get more followers on their YouTube channel, because there's Dan Stevens plays like a conspiracy theorist YouTuber. It is like a warning that this type of thing is maybe plausible because we are unable to trust or work with anybody else. So I thought that was actually really an interesting aspect to it. I don't know if it's going to land the plane. Obviously, I haven't finished it, but I was very interested in this. I enjoyed it so far, halfway through, and I'm definitely enjoying it. And it's only 6 episodes, very small commitment. And that's 0 Day. Check it out if that sounds interesting. The next thing I wanted to bring up was about Severance itself. I do a little check-in. This has become a pattern every week now, Sona, and it's consistently across the board. So first of all, I talk to you about the podcast. This is one of the few shows that me and my wife actually watch together, like we've ever watched together. It's not even like currently watching together. We never watch anything at the same time, except for this season of Severance, apparently. And Sona, just to let you know, when you're like, I don't know if I want to see any more goats. I wish they were back in the office. That general opinion, I think, is not uncommon. My wife has the exact same reaction. Like last week, she's like, oh, phew, they're back in the office again. Thank goodness. And one more point of reference is every single week when I record with Darren, I also ask him not how he liked the current episode of Severance, but how his wife liked the current episode of Severance. And it's exactly the same thing. He was just like, she wasn't really on board with the ortho, but they're back in the office. She's right back in there again.
The ortho episode was so conflicting because I hated the idea of it, but then so much happened that it was hard to argue with the existence or validity of it.
Right.
So it was like, I want to hate it, but there's so much interesting stuff happening that I can't hate it.
Well, that is exactly.
But the goats, though, that's
yeah, the goats are always a no-go.
That's a clean cut no for me.
Well, that's across the board, by the way, with everybody that I poll on that, which is so funny because I know that there are some fan base of these goat lovers. But it's such a minority because even Darren, when I do this weekly check-in, when we're talking about something else, and I'll be like, hey, what'd you think of the current episode of Severance? For that specific episode, he was like, oh, it was great. This. But man, we could have done without the goats. I'm like, I know everybody's like, please, no goats. But apparently the show thinks we want to see them. And by the way, not among our demographic, apparently, but the people definitely want to see it. If there's any reference to a goat at all on the show, even in minor, like even if someone just has some goat artwork on the wall, there will be headlines the next day on the Google News about the friggin' goats on Severance. I'm like, man, that's what people are clicking through for some reason. I don't understand.
And someone somewhere is so validated. See, I told you people would love the goats.
Absolutely, yes.
There was like a whole room of people going, do we really need the goats? And one person advocating for them. And now that person is validated.
And it may very well be the reason the show is as viral as it is, for sure. One more data point here. It's hard to get streaming ratings numbers, but there is a Nielsen streaming chart that gets published every single week. And Apple TV rarely has these shows that pop down to the top 5, the top 10. It's usually 8 out of the 10 shows, or maybe more sometimes, will be Netflix shows. And just interesting to note how this show is so important to Apple. The only real breakout show they've ever had is Ted Lasso. And with the premiere episode of Severance, these ratings go back 1 month. So they're just showing the first 2 episodes of the season so far. With the premiere episode of Severance, they made the top 10 list, which is the first time Apple had a show in the top 10 in quite some time. And then with the second week, the chart was just published yesterday, the audience had actually grown from episode 1 to episode 2. So it topped the best week that they'd ever had with Ted Lasso. Just to speak to the fact that this is an incredibly important show for Apple, right? It's like it is, if everybody was just like, well, Ted Lasso is the only thing anybody knows on Apple TV. Well, this has now eclipsed Ted Lasso. So it's a massively important, it's their signature show at this point. As if we didn't kind of feel it in the culture already. It definitely has. We have some evidence now of that. All right. And Sona, I read the Rickon book, The UUR.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And it's very funny. But I want to talk to you about some actual clues that are in there. But like I said, your patience may vary on this.
This is something that I raised when we first started talking about this season. This kind of subculture of this show has really become a force. And I, for one, am ambivalent about that
Yeah.
because, I don't have so much spare time in my life to dedicate to delving into all the Easter eggs and clues. And I'm not sure my interest is there. And I think as a television show, this does need to work on the level, and I think it does work on this level, of someone who just sits down and watches the show every week and then walks away and doesn't think about it again until it's on the next week. And I think it does work on that level, but I have like an anxiety related to the subculture because I feel like there's
Right.
so much going on that I could be missing. And I feel like somewhat obligated as a person who is talking about this show with you and wants other people to listen to me talking about this show with you to be well informed and well read about all of these different aspects, but it also seems insurmountable to me to keep up with all of this.
I said this to you at the beginning of the season, but I'm just reiterating it here for the audience as well. I want you to be the audience that's just watching
Thank
the
God.
show casually. I don't expect you to do all this additional research. And there's two parts to that. One is I think people get overinvested in this. A perfect example of this is the show Lost, which people became completely obsessed with. I think this show is much more intentional in its mystery and unpacking of that mystery than Lost was. I really do feel, even in the podcasts and the book about the making of the season of Lost that just came out last year, you really hear how they were saying, well, let's put this later in the season and then we'll solve that problem next season, right? Like it was,
they were figuring it out as they went.
Exactly. This seems to be much more designed from day one.
Agree.
So I have more confidence in the show in general. But more important than that is, I think regardless of whether it's well designed or bad design, that's all to be figured out when the thing resolves itself at the end. I think that even with Lost, people were probably better off. The people who enjoy Lost now, even these millennials that are now finding it on Netflix, where it was hugely popular when it came out last year and was available to stream for the first time in its entirety on Netflix. And it was a huge hit there. And like all these younger people were suddenly watching it. I think binging it, for example, like they were, without spending months or years of their lives doing all this background research and just watching it, was actually the better experience of that show. So these people who are really vested, especially in particular conspiracy theories and doubling down on that, if you start seeing the whole show from that perspective, and then the show goes in a completely different direction because you were wrong, or the show just forgets about that aspect, you're going to be really disappointed. So I think it's probably best. And I do have this confidence in the showrunners, by the way. I think if it matters, it's going to be in the text of the show. You don't have to do all this additional investigation. What I think is satisfying about the show is when I do some of this side investigation, the show seems to be very intentional, right? Like it doesn't seem to be that any of these weird things that I say, well, I wonder what that means. When I investigate it, it usually has another 5 or 6 connections that I hadn't noticed until that point when I do the deeper research. And it does make me think like, oh, wow, these people are very careful about what they're doing here, which makes me feel more confident, unlike Lost, for example. But I don't think it's required to enjoy this. And like I said, everything that was like an Easter egg in season 1 that I kind of figured out has now been overtly said in season 2. So I don't think anything is I don't think that the expectation is that you do all this additional homework.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I appreciate your perspective and allowing me to be the casual viewer that just pops in for an hour once a week. I agree with you, though. It is very intentional. And I will say also that there were things about Lost that I loved and I thought were brilliant. And the storytelling was amazing. The characters were amazing. I do think this show has the benefit of the hindsight, right? Of how things played out with Lost and the dissatisfaction around that. And so I give them credit for learning the lessons of that and, having a plan to tie up the loose ends from the start. I totally agree with you. This seems like a much more well thought out show. Whereas with Lost, it seemed like, well, it would be shocking to have a polar bear on this island. Let's figure out why it's there later.
Right.
So,
or the smoke monster, that the monster was supposed to be like a dinosaur of some kind at the beginning, and then it became the smoke monster, and then the smoke monster became some kind of a spirit or something. Like, I'm just like, well, okay, well, you guys don't know what you're talking about at this point. You're just making stuff up as you go along.
yeah. I mean, in the end, I think the value of Lost was much more in the character development than it
Absolutely.
was in the mythology of the island.
So maybe in that way, we dovetail into this conversation because I think this is the type of episode that my wife was not able to finish watching this. In the middle of the episode, we had to tuck my daughter in. I finished watching it. She'll probably finish watching it today. But even through the first half, which is approximately what she watched, she is very much on board with this particular episode, which I know when I go look at the message boards and I look at the ratings, some of these Severance episodes have a 9.5. Think about that. The average score is like a 9 or a 10 among the audience. And they're usually these mythology episodes. And these in-between episodes get like 7.5, 8.5 at best, right? And I guarantee you that's going to be.
Lovers are mad. Yeah.
And that's what's so funny. I guarantee you that this episode, which will be one of the lower rated ones, this is exactly the type of episode that my wife loves on this show,
Same.
right? Because it's all character development, right? And then I agree. Like, I like this show because I'm totally intrigued, and they definitely are not blowing it with the mystery. But I gotta care about these characters, so I need these episodes in between. These like non-essential episodes are the best episodes in the show for me. That's my opinion.
I agree. I think they were exploring a really fascinating idea in several different contexts about it. Almost reminded me of a soap opera idea of your evil twin, right?
Right. Yes, absolutely.
And like a very soap opera-ish trope of like, you slept with my evil twin and you didn't realize,
right?
It's that idea of this other version of you that is out there doing things and living a life that, like, should that be your life? Are they stealing your life? There's a lot to be explored there. I thought it was really interesting.
So yeah, as this episode opens, we see Ragabi and Mark are talking. This is immediately happening after the end of last week's episode, where he had that flash, that first memory of Miss Casey. And first of all, Adam Scott is incredible in this scene. Like, I don't think I've ever taken him serious as a serious actor. Of course, I liked him in Parks and Recreation. He's mostly a comedic actor. I even liked him in season 1 of the show, but Mark was never that complex. As his Audi Mark, he plays a very often reactionary version of this character. And as his Innie, it's almost like this benevolent, childish version of that character. But this is a lot of complexity here in this performance. And I just thought he did a great job. And I also like talking how the show subverts itself in the way it tells its story. I love the fact that, like, Miss Casey telling those stories about what your Audi is doing, which was so hilarious in season 1, has been like completely subverted here. It's so disturbing in this context because he is seeing his wife. Now you suddenly have to put yourself in his mind space. He's seeing his wife as this completely other person saying these arbitrary things. And he's saying to Ragabi, like, what are they doing to her? He's almost crying in this scene. I thought it was terrific.
I agree with you. And some tangential thoughts I had. First of all, something I've wondered since season 1, are these facts true?
The scuba diving, right? That's that's a Dylan thing. Maybe they are true, actually.
Right. I always wondered, are these just things that they've decided someone would like to hear about themselves? And so it's good for morale, or are these actual true facts? I also liked, on a much more superficial level than what you're addressing, last week I thought, in that last scene, well, he better tell Ragabi that this is happening to him because, at the moment
right.
He was just taking it all in. So I liked, just from a plotting perspective, that we picked up with him explaining exactly what was happening to her so that it wasn't like we wondered whether he's just internally struggling with this or has actually raised a flag to somebody that this is happening.
I mean, there's so many scenes here that I thought were really knockouts. This is not directed by Ben Stiller, by the way, this week. I was looking ahead at which episodes are directed by Stiller, just for the audience in general. This female director I forget her name, but she has directed a lot of American TV. She directed like The Old Man, for example, recently. But I did mention to my wife, I'm curious to see if maybe like this particular episode has a lot of female POV. I wonder if they brought in a female director to help massage some of that, because and then Stiller does the more like mythology heavy episodes.
Interesting point.
That may be what we're going to see. And by the way, they have had another director twice before. Sam Donovan, I think his name is, another British, done a lot of TV type of director. But it's interesting that she will be the director for this episode, next episode, and the 9th episode. And Ben Stiller will be the director for episode 8 and episode 10. Obviously, he's going to be the director for the finale. That's not surprising. But it is interesting that he's a director in episode 8, which makes me think that maybe something big mythology based is coming in that episode.
Interesting.
This is why the show costs so much. He's a real stickler for technical details. So I think that in episode 8, even if it's not like the big twist episode of the show or something, I wouldn't be surprised if there's some technical challenge to the directing there. So it might be another outside episode or something like that. But I do think it's interesting that they bring in maybe a more female perspective for this episode. And maybe that's why my wife liked it so much better. And maybe you as well, perhaps.
Yeah, I wouldn't say necessarily better, but I did think there was a lot being explored here that isn't natural to wonder about. So I'm happy they're addressing it. And those are emotional things that are being explored.
Yes. And maybe Stiller knows he's better at some things than others. Or maybe he just had limited time. Because this show takes a very long time to produce. And he's probably editing and planning in between. So anyway, back to that scene with Ragabi before we wrap up and we move on to the next. I did want to mention an important moment of dialogue. Once again, there's so many of these really great dialogue moments in this episode. And I love when he's talking about bargaining. He's explaining this to Ragabi as if she doesn't know that bargaining is, one of the stages of grief. Woe, right? Once again, going back to those 4 tempers inside of the Lumen philosophy. But really interesting is that he's talking about how there is this element of bargaining. Like, I would make it better if I just got a second chance. I would do things differently. And he says to her, I might have that chance, which is really true, right? How many people get to say, like, my loved one is coming back from the dead in a way?
And I'll also note that I brought up those stages of grieving to a therapist once and was told that those are no longer recognized as valid. So
interesting.
I actually Googled it after watching the show, because for some reason I did not do that after speaking with the therapist, but I did do it after watching Severance. I guess from my quick Google, it's not that they've been completely dismissed, but the way they used to be accepted as necessary stages of grieving in that order is not necessarily considered valid anymore, that everybody has their own personal way of grieving and the stages they go through that may come in any sequence and may or may not include all of the previously accepted stages.
That's an interesting point I hadn't even thought about, but it's going to tie into our conversation with the Rickon book. Not specifically. One of the things I thought about in reading that Rickon book is how there always has to be like a checklist or bullet points or some anagram, or acrostic that is
some order to it.
And there are all acrostics, so many of them inside of the Rickon book. It's very funny, by the way. I'll tell you a couple of them that made me laugh. But anyway, the reason I bring that up is that it seems to be that whether it's in the Cure philosophy or in just these self-help books in general, or even these things that are taken for granted, that there always is this pattern kind of thing where it's like you have to have like a list that people can memorize and work their way through, or the 12 step, that like the whole, I think about like NA and AA and those steps you have to go through. It's interesting that people require this type of scheduling of their grief potentially. They're definitely exploring that. I don't know if they're mocking it or they definitely are mocking it at times. So Ragabi says to him, I guess we're still in this scene because there's so much stuff that happens here. It's so short, but there was a lot of density to really all the scenes here in this episode. She says to him, she is still in there. We'll get her out, and then the two of you will be out here together. What did you think about this? At one point, I thought Ragabi might be a conspirator of some kind, if not for Lumen, maybe someone working against Lumen. But then here she seems to be very sincere in trying to help him out. But she also seems to be really vested in proving that this reintegration can work, even if it kills the patient. Like, what do you think about, do you think she believes this and how she may be abusing this relationship?
I don't think I've given as much thought to this character as you have, but it struck me as sincere. It felt like she meant it at the time.
I think this is the first time we've had them sit down in this way. She's always so hard, bullying him in some ways. Just sit still so I can try to do some brain surgery on you, for God's sakes. And this is the first time she seemed to have this real empathy towards his situation.
I agree. And in her defense, she's doing something very serious. So I don't blame her for snapping at him a little bit.
Yes.
I mean, did you see the hole in his head at the end of this episode?
Yes. Well, it's already there. She just has to go right back in there again. Conveniently, it's already there. Then we're back in the office. And this is interesting because with Burt gone, we have created a triangle. There's only these three people. We see it in their desk orientation. There's literally a triangle in the middle of it. And I do want to think about this idea of the triangle and the dynamic of the triangle, like you brought up last week, that it's a tricky dynamic when you have three.
Yeah, I think were we talking about it in connection with White Lotus or with this?
Oh, maybe it was the White Lotus. Maybe it was.
My comment remains valid.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, just in case it's confusing to somebody who
doesn't listen to everything we do. You should listen to all of our conversations, everybody. That way you're always in the loop. A way to pitch our other episodes.
Yes. Short summary, 3 is a dangerous dynamic because it's very easy for 2 people to gang up against the third.
Exactly. And the reason I bring that up is because I'm going to bring up triangles over and over and over again in this episode, because if there's any thematic here, it is exactly that. It's like, what is the dynamic when it's not 4, not when there's pairs, but what's the dynamic when there's 3? And how that dynamic is always slippery, right?
Mm-hmm.
The 3 of them are in the kitchen together. Dylan is filling them in. By the way, something we saw in last week's episode, really across the board, I want to shout it out. A lot of mirrors in this show in general, but we see it again. There's this mirror in the kitchen. You see the 3 of them talking. In the mirror, you don't see Mark. You only see Helly and Dylan, I believe, showing already that there's some segmentation of the groups and even within this 3. Just to bring up how the show brings us up over and over again. There's that great scene in the bathroom last week when Helly comes in and Mark is freaking out. And Helly is saying, "It's me." And she's talking to him. In the mirror, we see her reflected. So it's as if the Helena character is there. Is she watching? Is it in his mind? But there's like another version of her that's also there present in the room. And the show does this constantly. It's very clever in the way that it's plays out this duality, which of course is a huge theme in the show itself. Basically, look at mirrors in this show. It's very important. There's a lot of them. And whenever there's a mirror, in general with movies, by the way, always check out mirrors. Mirrors are very important. You've probably noticed that if you're watching like a spy show and someone goes into the kitchen and there's a mirror, the protagonist can't see, and someone's left alone in the other room, they're doing something in the mirror. There's extra information always. So mirrors are very important in movies and TV shows in general, but especially in this show. I do like the context of that conversation where Dylan is telling them about the instructions that he found, the dark hallway. He seems to have memorized most of it, which is interesting, even though he only looked at it once. Maybe he has seen it multiple times, but he keeps putting it back. Interesting that they're suddenly trusting Helly, because if this is Helena, obviously they're telling her, so they must trust that it's truly her now at this point. I do like how she mocks him, going like, "Oh,
best comment. Oh, I love this.
You mean the picture of you when you were actually brave?"
Yes, I love it.
Dylan leaves, I guess, to go get the map at this point. And this is when Mark starts to glitch. And this is interesting because things are changing. Some of the things stay in both perspectives. He sees his living room at home. In the kitchen, keeps flipping back and forth. But he sees Helena in both contexts, which at first I'm like, has Helena, or I should say Helly, I guess, and then Helena, has Helena been in his house, or is this just a glitch? And the way that the show plays with time later on, I did make me wonder. It does illustrate that he's losing his place in time, basically, in his mind. Which is what I wanted to see, by the way. I complained that after that first episode of reintegration, I'm like, what is that going to be like when suddenly you're remembering someone else's memories? Like, that's going to be very disorienting. And we are actually seeing it here visualized in the show itself.
Yes, and it feels very disorienting just to watch it.
Yeah, I think it's genius later on when he slips from being an innie. Like, he doesn't have that clean break of being an innie and then going through the elevator and then being the Audi. He just slips into the after effect when he's back with Ragabi. And it's as if he's forgotten that he came home. He's just remembering being inside and now boom, he's outside. And it's because those memories are blurring together. It's very well done. And it also is suspenseful in a way, because in my mind, I start thinking, what happens if he starts to slip in public, right? Like,
absolutely.
Either way, right? Like his Audi starts to reveal things. And if he's being observed, which we assume he probably is, if he's being observed by Lumen, they're going to be suspicious. But worse is being inside and then revealing that something's happening.
The whole thing seems just very fraught with possibilities for things going terribly, terribly wrong.
Then we see Mr. Milchik, Seth, and Ms. Wong, and he is stewing about his review.
As we do. This is so relatable, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I meant to ask you last week, have you ever had a performance review that felt like Milchik's performance review? Because I have.
I worked at a company at one point where it was like an open secret that all the managers had to give negative reviews because they had limited budget. It just infuriated me because I felt like it wasn't that it wasn't valid. It was that it was such nitpicking of such crap.
I had a review at a job where the communication was nonstop. I would get hundreds of different communications a day, whether by Gmail, GChat, text, or phone call. Hundreds. It was a barrage nonstop throughout the day. In my written review, someone pointed out a single email that I had not responded to.
Oh, God.
A single email. Out of hundreds I would get every single day over a period of 6 months, they noticed one email that I didn't respond to and documented it. And this to me feels very equivalent to the paperclip complaint.
The paperclip, yes. By the way, maybe that's why I don't really relate to that particular review, because I found it so funny and so telling that the performance review includes these incredibly minor details of like the paperclip position and stuff like that, which is hilarious and very much is like what you just described with the emails. And then you have
the calamitous orpo.
Exactly. The calamitous orpo. Exactly.
Also, which is just like, nearly killed our leader in training.
You almost killed the CEO, by the way. Like, that is, you really buried the lead there. I'm trying to tell you. At least they did say, well, that is what we are going to primarily be talking about. But it is telling that Milchik has internalized those other minor ones here as well.
Well, he can't undo almost drowning Helena.
That's true.
But true. He can use his paper clips properly. Although I think maybe I've been using paper clips improperly. How do you use a paper clip? Does the small part go in front or in back?
I do it in the back all the time.
I do it in the front all the time, but I thought they were showing he was correcting himself by putting the small part in the back.
Oh, I usually do the small part in the back. So I actually maybe misunderstood what I was seeing there. I thought he was doing the small part in the front.
See, to me, it's intuitive to put the small part in the front.
Oh, see, I do the opposite. See,
I would probably get written up at Lumen. But like I previously said, I hate paper clips. So it's stapler or binder clip in my life. So this probably wouldn't come up. I did question my lifelong use of paper clips while watching this. Maybe I don't know how to use them.
Maybe they forced you to use paper clips, so you couldn't use stapler if you wanted to. That could be, you could get written up for that.
I have hurt myself with a staple on more than one occasion.
They could be dangerous, see? But a paper clip, they can separate, and then what's the point of binding them together at all if they're going to separate anyway?
That's what I'm saying.
All things that Milchik is considering. No. But he has Miss Wong come in, and then interesting here, he still uses too many big words, and which he tries to correct later on. But he does mention to her that you cannot graduate from this fellowship until I have deemed you wintertide material. Wintertide, which I guess is whatever this is for her fellowship, the proper level to achieve to graduate. He's reminding her that he does decide her fate, and he knows full well that she was the complainer about the big words. And let's talk about the scene where is this self-flagellation that he is doing this with the thousands, perhaps, of paperclips, a giant container of paperclips? Or do you think this is Lumen training?
I felt he was punishing himself.
Me too.
Between that and the scene where we see him rehearsing smaller and smaller words with shorter and shorter sentences.
Yes.
But then, it seems like there's an anger inside him, right?
That absolutely.
We've seen a lighter side of Milchik, I think, somewhat.
Yes.
But he's back to the dark side at the end of this scene.
Well, he's a really interesting character, especially because we don't get interiority from him, basically, right? We're only just watching him and trying to understand what's happening with him. And I think that he's very conflicted, right? Like he is feeling alienated more and more from Lumen, but then he is punishing himself, like he is internalizing their criticism. But I think it's going to break at some point. He's going to have to choose.
I agree.
And what a great performance, by the way. This actor, Terrell Tillman, has been doing a lot of interviews recently. He was in the New York Times just this week. It's great that he's having this glow up. He hasn't done a lot of work before this, and he's such a great performer here. And the scene where he mirrors again, it's funny that he just like slides the door over and he just happens to have a mirror there for himself. He looks at himself in the mirror and he starts with that phrase that he used with Miss Wong, where you must eradicate from your essence childish folly. And then he changes that to you must abandon childish things. And then he goes to grow up. But it seems like he's talking to himself at that point. He starts to get very emotional, actually, here. I thought this was really powerful because I think at some point he's telling himself he needs to grow up.
And then just grow.
I thought that was very interesting because he's going from grow up, where it's as if you're chastising yourself, like grow up. But then grow is like, he's like taking it and empowering himself with it to say like grow past this. So it's interesting the way these mantras actually work. What do you think that means for him? And if he's telling himself he needs to grow up, he needs to give up these childish things, that could be read as he needs to surrender his loyalty to this philosophy and this company. The other way to think about it is that he needs to surrender these ideals that he had of like a kinder, gentler management system, for example. So do you have an opinion either way?
I read it as the second one, or I heard it, saw it as the second one, where he's trying to convince himself to adapt to this whole Lumen philosophy.
It feels like that is where he's leaning, especially when you think about him in the elevator last week. Speaking of the elevator last week, that is the conversation Mark and Helly are having in the bathroom, in the co-ed bathroom. I like how he's telling him, yeah, he cornered me in the elevator, but he's not explaining exactly what the context is. And then I love this phrase he uses as she's about to go and she wants to go see if Dylan has the map and they want to go find the elevator. And as she's about to go out the door, he goes, by the way, we shared vessels.
Yes.
And she's like, what? What does that mean?
I'm happy that this isn't a season-long secret. I'm happy that they got this out there and addressed it so soon. That was satisfying for me. And yes, I liked her reaction to this as well.
I do agree that he had to tell her, right? Because the idea that this is going to be used against him potentially by Milchik, right? Like in the same way that it was used last week. That's obviously not the way. I mean, it's not going to be easier for her to hear it from him. This is actually Mark stepping up in a way because given his behavior in the past, splitting himself in two to not deal with the death of his wife, this is maybe a step in the right direction for his character.
Yeah, I agree.
And here's the beginning of many scenes here in this episode where we have two people talking to each other about someone who's absent. So this like a triangle where the third leg of the stool basically is missing from the scene. And here we have, I had sex with Helena. I thought it was you. And then Helly and Mark negotiating this third person. But then, of course, there's the whole subtext here of we're searching for Gemma, and then Gemma and outside Mark, of course, have a relationship, which potentially is another block for any kind of relationship between Innie, Mark, and Helly, right? Because think about it. If he releases Gemma and then he quits the company, because he quits the company, they don't need Helly down there anymore, and Helena is in the outside world, well, then there is no Innie Mark, there is no Helly, destroys this whole romance that they have. Ends it, literally.
Yeah, I mean, there's also like a parallel to the Burt Irving thing, right? That happens later in the episode. And to your point here, I think, if I'm remembering right, she even initially thinks he's talking about Gemma when he says, I had sex with her, right?
Exactly, yes. So like two triangles here, and there could, like you said, there's confusion as to who anyone's even talking about.
Right, yes. Right, which version of you and who are you talking about sleeping with?
Exactly.
Yes.
Who are you sleeping with? Which version of you is sleeping with who?
Yeah.
Too many triangles here, potentially.
I don't know how to feel about it until I can narrow down.
Yeah, I need more clues.
Yes.
I need more information. Yeah, and then of course she takes this very badly. She needs to walk it off. I felt really bad for her, especially when they cut back later on and she's like curled up in the end of that hallway.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think this was a fairly mature reaction to the news.
Yes, exactly.
To just say, I got to go for a walk and process this. She's definitely going through a lot here.
Well, I think that it's interesting. Her Helly and Helena, first of all, they're very aloof. Whether it's Helena in her coldness or whether it's Helly in playing everything off as a joke, they don't show any kind of emotion. And especially with Helly, if they show any kind of emotion, it is anger, right? It's like she is willing to commit suicide in season 1 to get revenge. And but she wouldn't break down and cry, for example. She'll just be like, oh, yeah. So there is a certain viciousness to her character, which I mean, I think is true of people. There's a lot of people who will not show any emotion except for anger, right? I think that is something that is potentially true. There's a lot of malice,
which,
to use the cure and metaphor. There's a lot of malice in there.
And therapy speak would be anger is a secondary emotion. The anger is a result of you feeling something else, right? Whether you feel hurt or you feel disappointed or you feel rejected or you haven't processed that and you just jump straight to the anger. But I did wonder, to your point, whether we would see Helly cry here.
Oh, yeah.
But we didn't.
That's why I'm saying that's not how she expresses herself. We've seen her go to the darkest places last season. This is a much more mature way to deal with it. So maybe she is growing as well. It's interesting when she eventually does talk to Mark and she mentions how she felt so used by Helena and how Helena also manipulated her friends. And you could have a whole episode about it. So it's not something that the show needs to keep doubling down on. But it does make you think, just for a moment, if you take this seriously, how betrayed she must feel at this moment. And how impotent, she has no control over her own body even.
I can't imagine what it would be like to process this. And I give her credit for at least somewhat accepting that Mark didn't realize that it wasn't. The more human reaction would be to be angry that he couldn't tell the difference between the two of them.
Sure, yeah. And I have something to say about that when we get to that later scene. But before we get there, to the lovemaking scene between Mark and Helly, Dylan and Gretchen have another meeting. Innie Dylan. This whole conversation is really interesting. He's asking her questions about the Audi. There's little Easter eggs here, by the way. He says scuba diving. He goes, oh, actually, you know what? He did want to go scuba diving last year. He took some lessons. And then there was the caricatures we saw last year, like one of the rewards that people get. And in one of the characters that he had drawn about himself, he was scuba diving. It maybe just speaks to the fact that there's something innately in them that they want to scuba dive. This is kind of a sad scene. He says, oh, it seems like maybe he's just looking for his out. He's looking for something that he can be really good at, which I think we all feel that at points in our lives. So it's understandable. It's an interesting dynamic to imagine another, like a younger version of ourselves, a more idealized version of ourselves, trying to see the compromised version of ourselves decades later, right? And like thinking like, well, maybe, like trying to have a positive spin on what is going on there. She, of course, feels that maybe he's just unhappy in general, maybe unhappy with her, the subtext there, or unhappy being in this family that they've built together. which I think people do worry about. Obviously, when you're in a long-term relationship or friendship or anything with people, whether that it's just happenstance at that point and they're not really happy in the circumstance, because that's not possible because I want to spend my whole day here with you, which of course is what she wants to hear. And then he says, oh, am I being too forward? But of course she said, I love you last week. So that's, or 2 weeks ago. So I guess that's even more forward. And yeah, there's the hugging and the kissing, and it's so sweet. And I think this goes back to the question you asked me. Yeah, and you might have brought it up again last week with, can you believe that she's not talking to him about this when she gets home? I think explicitly we see that dynamic again, where she not only doesn't talk to him about it, she tells him that it was canceled because she's so uncomfortable talking about.
Yes.
If she really tells him what she wants to say, it's probably a conversation that never is going to end. She's going to be like, oh, he's, maybe judgmental about you. It's the version of you that I fell in love with that is not present anymore. There's all these really uncomfortable aspects to those interactions. When they're together, it's really sweet. The contrast between them barely speaking at home and those scenes inside are really telling.
The first time they met, it was fairly awkward, and understandably so. Now it's become like they're on a date, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
They're flirting with each other. They're connecting. So now,
they're
and
kissing.
This is why I find that like evil twin idea interesting, that soap opera type trope. She's cheating on him with him in a way, right?
Exactly.
It's just a different version of him that she now likes better. And so now she has to hide the fact that she likes that version of him better than the outside version of him, which is very awkward.
And once again, this is that theme I mentioned in maybe in the whole season now at this point, now that retroactively, but definitely explicit in this particular episode, the two people talking about the absent third person. And you see the two Innie, or her with the Innie, and they're talking about the Audi version of Dylan is like the haunting this conversation. And then, of course, her talking with Audi version of Dylan, completely different dynamic, like you mentioned. And of course, the absent Innie version. So like you said, it's a very interesting throuple where, which a term that was brought up earlier in this season, by the way, but it's like a very bizarre throuple that's occurring there. It's the two people, but inhabiting three different spaces. So it's a strange dynamic for sure. Oh, and speaking of something that I think is going to be plot at some point, pure guess here, but I think that there will be some kind of proposition made to Dylan that maybe if he betrays the rest of the Innies or does something for Lumen, that Innie Dylan has a chance to become full-time Dylan. And I already suspected this might be a prize of all prizes for Dylan in the future, and that would be a possibility, that's already in the back of my mind. And then he explicitly says, I wish we could really be together, like all the time. And I'm like, right. And he says it overtly, and like they've hinted at it. And now that he said it out loud, this is going to be a theme of the show, whether it's actually going to happen or whether it's going to be something that is going to be, that he is going to try to make happen. I think it's going to be an engine for the rest of the story.
And we're already exploring the different versions of inside and outside, and with Mark, the merging of them, and with him, maybe the inside taking over the outside one's life. And then there are a lot of different mutations of the system that can occur as to who wants to live the other one's life, I guess.
Could you imagine Innie Dylan shows up because of the Stockholm block or whatever it was, the thing that they used on Helly to make her permanently. Glasgow, that's right. If he showed up at the house and it's like, you have to protect me. I'm actually Innie Dylan. You look at her dynamic and I'm like, is she going to say no? Could you imagine like suddenly like being with this ideal version of your spouse again? And could you imagine how appreciative and loving he would be as a dad with these kids all of a sudden? I don't think she could turn it down. And then on the one hand, you could say, well, but isn't she like killing one version of her husband, right? Potentially. I think this is not an accident that later in this episode, there's a whole conversation about what is the selfness or the soul, specifically at a religious level, but I don't think you have to think about it at a religious level. what do you owe that innie? If the innie is a true full person, don't they deserve a full life? So at some point, one or the other has to go.
They cannot coexist.
They cannot, right? They cannot inhabit the same space at the same time. Two objects cannot. Oh, I also like to detail that, just driving home the fact that he is still not the best planner or the best at taking care of his family. He's like saying, like, we have to buy a new car. They're practically giving them away. And she's just like, oh no, this is what we need now. We went from like 3 weeks ago, he had no job and was panicking about that, to now working again. It's like, oh, time to buy a new car. It's like, great. Can we just dig our way out of one hole before we find another one?
Knowing this other version of him is probably making her even more impatient and frustrated with this outside version of him, right? Because the contrast is like in your face and stark. Whereas before it was a theoretical idea, right? Of I wish my partner could be like this. I wish my partner could be like that. I wish he would do less of this and more of that. Now it's like there is a version of him that is exactly what I want. He's just not here right now.
Exactly. Not dead, just not here.
Yeah, exactly.
But yes, and it makes you replay their initial interactions in that first meeting, where she walks in and it's almost like she's surprised to see him there. Once again, I love putting myself in these bizarre situations and taking him seriously and putting myself in the head of the character. Could you imagine she's expecting to see the same kind of like, whatever, I got to get back to my desk, see you later version of her husband, and that is not at all what she gets. And she's probably could have it all in a way, and it's not even like she has to get rid of her husband. She just has a different version of him, and he's right there, he's within reach. She can visit him if she wants to, right? So, anyway, all really fascinating actually to me. While they're kissing, Mark and Helly are hooking up. I find it interesting that she has scoped out this place, her own version of a tent. I like when she goes, tents, just like the first time.
Yes.
I don't know how many pillows they have laying around, but they probably have like cushions for seats and stuff. This is having sex on this floor in an office is not going to be a comfortable position. Beggars can't be choosers, but still, this is not ideal in any way. This is where I wanted to put a pin in the previous conversation of how she's angry that he should have known the difference. You think about her here, Helena, they obviously had an intense lovemaking scene in an earlier episode, and she seemed to be very sincere. But think about it. This innie has never actually has like an actual memory. And I do have questions about this, by the way, of ever having sex, right? So this is a new experience for her. And when you think about Helly's,
good point. I hadn't thought about that at the time. Yeah.
Right. When you think about Helly's reaction to this versus Helena, I literally wrote it down in my notes when I was watching this. I'm like, he should have known. Sorry, he should have known.
This woman has had sex before.
But speaking of that, he's very confident in this. And I'm like, where does that confidence?
Wait. Yes, I was about to say, but you're saying he should have known, but then what context did he have to judge anything? So
that's what I wrote. Yeah. That's what I wrote down. Like, wasn't he a virgin like a week ago?
Yes,
and he's the Mac Daddy all of a sudden. He got really good really fast. Although maybe your body remembers, in a way that I'll cut it some slack because it should be like this should
muscle
be like
memory.
Exactly. I mean, this should play out like teenagers, going at it for the first time, and should be very clumsy and fumbling. She does seem to be a little bit more like trepidatious about it. And that's where I was saying that he should have picked up on that. But he does not seem at all. And like I said, I mean, it's not like he has that much more experience than she does.
Right.
The innie version of himself, right?
Right.
I do like, by the way, that as they're making love, they cut back to the empty tri-station. I'm like, those refinement numbers are not going to be that great today. That's for sure.
He's stuck at 81% or however far along he was when they talked.
It's not even like Dylan is there. Like there used to be at least like Dylan or Irv would be at the desk. It's like there's nobody doing work today of any kind. When they're walking back to their tri-stations, she asks, was it different with me? Once again, very smooth here. All of a sudden, he leans in for that kiss as an answer.
It was very interesting to me that there were no words in response to the question. Just
Exactly.
let's not get into that.
He starts to bleed. I think this is what the show's saying, that him being in love with Helly now and having that part of himself, it's now these two things can't coexist. There's an Audi version of him who has a completely different agenda, and these agendas are starting to bump up inside his subconscious. This is when they go see Miss Wong. She provides some medical assistance. I like when she goes, "What was happening when you guys were, when this happened?" Helly goes, "We were refining something."
Technically true.
I guess.
I think, by the way, I have heard that now you're supposed to treat a bloody nose by leaning forward, not backwards. Just FYI.
I've heard the same thing. That helps it clot.
Yeah, you can tell we have small kids at home.
And this is a really interesting sequence as well. He's getting the assistance from Miss Wong, but then we start hearing any cloudiness, any hallucinations, which of course is actually not Miss Wong, it's Ragabi. He's like, "What? Huh?" And she's like, "Where were you right now?" So we don't have that clean break of exiting through the elevator. It's this slide from one person into the other. He doesn't even remember how he got from one place to the other. And Ragabi thinks this is great. It's like, "Oh, you had a memory, and it's a recent one." But he's just like, "I don't know where I am. What's going on?"
So disorienting. Holy cow.
Her idea is, "Oh, I know. Why am I having you drink this goop with the activator in it? You're just going to flood the chip with this. I'm going to stick a syringe right into your head."
This was really tough for me to watch.
I really felt for him at this moment where he's just like, "I am just a human pincushion at this point. I've completely disoriented. This is not what I was expecting. And now you want to accelerate the process." And she, of course, is excited about this possibility. And he also apparently gets very hungry, and which is also a side effect of this reintegration. And he decides to go to Zufu. This is like, we've usually only gone to Pips, I think, so far on this show, the only place we've seen. But he goes to have some Asian cuisine of some kind.
I feel like it was Chinese. And then I thought, yeah, every town has a Chinese place somehow, no matter how small. There's always a Chinese restaurant.
Oh, always. Yeah, exactly. Like when my wife was just up in Vermont, where her mother lives, in the snowstorm. They went up there for the snow, believe it or not. But they're good at cleaning out the snow up there. So even with a foot of snow, they
yes, I bet.
And they, of course, have Chinese restaurant right in the middle of town. They only have like 2 restaurants, but there's always a Chinese restaurant everywhere you go. Pizza shop and a Chinese restaurant. And he's there, like literally just shoveling food into his face. But who else is there? Helena's there as well.
And is it a coincidence? What do you think?
No, it's not a coincidence.
I agree with you.
Impossible. Last episode, I didn't even mention this, but there's a moment when he is walking out at the end of the day, and we see Helena in the lobby. She's like out of focus. We just see the back of her hair. You can only tell it's her, by the way, because of Britt Lauer's unique hair color. I don't know if she dyed her hair for this show, but it has like that reddish overtone and that darker red undertone. So she has spotted Mark once, him leaving the office while she's up in her office, exiting the complex. And then now in the lobby while he's exiting. And now in this episode, she has followed him all the way to wherever he is. A few interesting details here. And I've suspected this already when she's like, "Oh, hi, I'm Helena Egan." He's like, "I know who you are." So he would have done his own research as far as who Helena Egan is. And then another triangle scene, of course, where I should say Gemma is the third wheel. I mean, there are so many triangles in the course of this conversation that I can't even outline them all. Obviously, there is the Innie Mark is with Helly. He's with Helena. So then those are multiple different, that's a square. At least there's multiple triangles within the square. But they have instant chemistry, which is another thing that I think the show is trying to illustrate here, that it's interesting that, for example, he does not have any chemistry with Miss Casey. When you see Innie Dillon and his wife have this instant affinity towards each other. And here, Helena and Audi Mark immediately hit it off. They have the same sense of humor. She's like, "Oh, you should be my father sometime." And he goes, "Oh, you're going to introduce me to the dad already?"
That's great. Yeah.
And then there's all this subtext to what they're saying as well. Isn't it about time? It's like, because she knows, of course, they've been together in a form for quite some time now. And then it gets dark and disturbing as soon as she goes, "Well, you've been through a lot with your wife. And as soon as she says that, of course, it breaks the spell, because think about what's going on there. Even Audi Mark, now I know I have actually had a memory of my wife in there. You are the CEO of this company. She's overtly saying that, I run the company.
Mm-hmm.
And this person brings up your wife when you know that she's down there. Miss Cobell knew about it, so Helena definitely knows about it. She completely misplayed things. They go from that flirtatious interaction, and he immediately goes cold emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's about to leave. He's obviously freaking out. But what's interesting is that then they get close, and she's like, what? And it's almost like he's about to kiss her. It's like,
yeah,
which of course they just kissed earlier that day, right? So it is this weird muscle memory that you were talking about. Their bodies remember being together in a way.
Are attracted to each other. Yeah, it's like a magnet.
Exactly.
Well, what did you think about her misnaming his wife?
Hannah, right? She calls her
Yeah.
Hannah. That obviously is intentionally
right.
Her pretending like, well, I don't know that much about her, because there's no way. Ragabi said, I don't know what they're doing to her down there, but that she's essential. We know that whatever this cold storage file cleansing that's occurred is definitely related to her. In that very first episode, we see Miss Casey's face when he's cleaning the file, as if with the cold storage and her heartbeat and everything else on it. So whatever that alternate version of that screen that we're seeing, somebody's monitoring her, she is correlated 1-to-1 with this file that he's cleansing. And this is the most important thing the company has ever done. So she absolutely knows that her name is Gemma and not Hannah. So it's weird that she's intentionally getting it wrong.
And knowing that's going to antagonize him. Yeah.
Yes, he knows full well that they have her imprisoned down there. On top of that, not even getting her name right. So yeah, it is a little bit of like an insult to injury there. And like, you're right also that Helena is overplaying her cards there. I think trying to get a reaction from him, I'm guessing here, I think she's interested in him still, continuing some kind of relationship with him, fascinated by the relationship that her Innie has with him. And maybe she also has feelings for him, and maybe their bodies have feelings for each other that they don't even understand. All of that stuff is happening. But I think also as an Egan, she wants to know, how much does he know? Like, what's going on with this Audi?
She asks him, I want to talk to you about the overtime contingency, right? But, what happened? It must have been so crazy.
Right. And you know that they've been wanting to figure out exactly what they know.
Right.
They've also shown up at Devin's house and were asking questions about what he had said that night, right? So they're monitoring the family in general. And then he walks out of the Chinese restaurant and he is panicking. Like, even the style of the filmmaking goes into like full on film noir at this point. I need to accelerate this process ASAP. They are onto me. And for better or worse, he goes home, apologizes to Ragabi, who's eating ice cream, by the way. And she has horrible eating habits. Like, every time we see her, she's eating potato chips or ice cream. And then she asked him to go buy eggnog for her the other day. Like, this is not good. She's going to have a heart attack down there. And now he's ready to speed things up. Speaking of being monitored by people, Irv goes to meet with Burt and his husband. And in the meantime, Drummond is in his apartment and has broken into his footlocker and finds all the research he's doing. Did you notice that Drummond has the word frolic tattooed on his hand, by the way?
I did notice that.
An interesting detail. Yes, the Egans and the Lumen Company in general are spying on all these guys ever since that occurrence. And then we get to this incredible new triangle that we haven't explored yet, which is Burt, Irving, and Fields, and Innie, Burt, Innie, Irving, and maybe even the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, considering the direction this conversation goes in. Interesting that the Fields character, I'm like, who are they going to get to play this character? I've only ever seen this actor on the show Fringe. Speaking of Lost, another J.J. Abrams show. Did you ever watch Fringe?
I never did.
He's like the star of the show. He's like this crazy scientist, and there's like all these people. There's like alternate realities. It's another one of these puzzle box shows, by the way, and from J.J. Abrams. So maybe another connection to another conspiracy thriller show. They have doubles, by the way. They run into their doubles because they travel through like dimensions. And when they go into other dimensions, eventually, this is kind of a spoiler because it happens pretty late in that series, but they eventually run into different versions of themselves when they go into multiple dimensions. So anyway, maybe they're winking at that show as well. Although I don't think there's any interdimensional stuff going on here in this show.
Right. Agree.
This episode was already full of highlights for me. All the stuff between Helena and Mark, and then Helly and Mark, Innie Mark, the Dylan stuff, all this stuff, all great interactions.
Agree.
But nothing better, I think, than this incredible sequence where he goes to hang out with Fields. And there's stuff that's here that's mythological. There's stuff here that is spiritual. I like that Fields first says to him when he sees him, he goes, "Sure, come in. What's mine is yours." Of course, referencing what's going on in there, or what might have been going on in there. And here's where things get really interesting. So he asks Burt, okay, so what brought you to Lumen? What brought you to be severed? First of all, the dialogue's hilarious here, where Burt says Jesus. And Irv says, "Jesus Christ?"
Christ.
and Burt goes, "That's the one."
The one and only.
The one and only. So it turns out they're Lutheran, so they were religious. He was a scoundrel, Burt was. They've been together for quite some time, at least 30-something years, right? So they've been together for a really long time. They were Lutherans. They were attending services. And they said that Burt had been a scoundrel when he was younger. I guess he cheated a lot on Fields. And Fields started to think, given their religious nature, if you're such a bad person, then you're not going to go to heaven, basically, is what it comes down to. Another reference to heaven, by the way, which we've seen multiple times over the course of this show. And at that time, it was around the time that Severance was in the news. It was a new thing. I had asked this question earlier on, how long has this been around for? Is this like 40 years? Because we were thinking about, well, is it possible that Cobell was severed when she was younger, etc.? Turns out it's only about 12 years ago, which I kind of suspected. It couldn't be that long ago, or it would have been more mainstream at this point in the show. And apparently their pastor in the sermon says the church had thought on this, and their opinion was that innies must have their own personhood. Therefore, they have their own souls. So if there was a good man, Burt Goodman, there's a good version of him inside as an innie, then that person could go to heaven, right? And of course, it makes you think about, if you believe these things religiously, then what happens to your soul when there's two versions of you potentially? And then Burt interjects here because he's definitely the more caustic version, the person in this couple. He's like, "While the Audi burns." So
because practically speaking, how would this even work?
Exactly, right? You'd have to have two souls within you.
Yeah, and you haven't created a new, I guess the argument is that you have created a new soul by undergoing the severance process. Right. Maybe your soul gets split in two, theoretically, like a worm that then regenerates. I don't know.
Right. And I do think, honestly, that some people are going to think about this section of it as more weirdness. I don't think it's weirdness, right? People have religious beliefs. People believe that they have an eternal soul. A majority of Americans, by the way, right? So if you believe that, and then you could actually do something like this, it makes you ask that question exactly like you're saying. Like, how do you mechanically split someone's soul in half, theoretically? And can a person do that? And maybe Lumen thinks they have done that, and that theoretically, if you really do believe this, then you think that you have created a way to expunge yourself of sins and things, right? So there's all those aspects to it, but it just makes you think about philosophically just personhood itself, right? Like, imagine you commit terrible sins and then you reform yourself. Well, are you the bad person who did those bad things, or are you the good person that you are now? And then, like, does your soul, if you really believe in souls, does your soul carry those sins from before? Like, it's asks a lot of really interesting philosophical questions. And it's pretty clear here that the more religious of the two is Fields, right? Because Burt seems to be kind of rolling his eyes at all of this.
I'm not sure they're entirely on the same page about what's happened here and the reasons it's happened. And, there's this conflict about the timeline that comes up immediately after that makes it seem that maybe things are a little simpler in Fields' mind than they are in Burt's, and his motivations are simpler in Fields' mind than they are in Burt's.
First of all, Irv, to his credit, hearing all this, he just goes, "Wow."
What else can you do?
Really, I am constantly trying to put myself in the perspective of these characters. And I laughed out loud when he said, wow, because I pictured myself at that dinner party and then everybody turning to me, waiting for a reaction. And I would just be like, wow.
Eating your cumin glazed ham.
That's what I would do. I'd just be like, And Burt reads that perfectly. He's looking for the exit. I like the fact that they're not taking Field's religious beliefs and just mocking him for it. Field says, I'm not some kind of zealot. He explains himself. And he actually says later on that I think innies deserved to experience love as well. And I hope it was beautiful. I mean it. And he really does mean it, right? And I thought that was very sweet. He's like a real believer, right? And he's not just selfishly thinking about this for himself. He actually does feel like these people, if they have souls, deserve to have the full experience of life. There's something very telling early on when he's talking about how the innie gets to go to heaven and he turns to Irv and he goes, with me, which is once again an interesting, unforeseen consequence here. Just because you think, so there's this good man to come to heaven with me, you don't have ownership of that person. He fell in love with somebody else.
See, this is where I get caught up in the mechanics of it.
Yeah.
Why would the inside version that Fields does not know, why would they be together?
He's thinking just part one. I split them in two. There's a good version of him. That one goes to heaven. That's what the pastor said. And by the way, it's not just Fields making this assumption. It's the person who severs themselves saying that, that guy, he'll just go in there and he'll do all the work and he'll do the boring stuff that I don't want to do. She'll deal with the pregnancy and then I just turn her off when I'm done, right?
Yeah.
That person had a whole life that you are not. It is that callousness towards the innie that is represented here. It's like, the innie is not just a tool to get you a good soul. It's experiencing a life inside that you're detached from. So that person, you think is going to go up to heaven with you, quote unquote, if you really do believe that, that person is going to not know who you are. Why would they want to spend eternity with you? Seeing the innie purely as a tool and not as a person.
Even if that were the case, if you continue to be an evil person in the outside world, I don't think you can net that out. It just seems impossible to reconcile that idea of the inside version being good and redeemable and can go to heaven with the idea of then the whole of that person is in heaven with the outside relationships, but none of the inside relationships.
That's why I think
my head hurt.
But that's what I think is interesting about this dichotomy is putting it in religious terms, because everything you're saying, even without religious terms, maybe your innie is now doing horrible crimes on behalf of Lumen. And it's just I don't know about them, so it's okay.
Sure.
It's the opposite cuts as well. So I don't think it has to only be theological terms. I just think it's interesting that they force the conversation by thinking about actually okay, you're a good person, you go to heaven. Which version of you goes? Does none of you go? Do both of you go? What happens, right? So I just think that that's an interesting dynamic that's explored here when they.
I agree with all of that. I'm just saying Fields' own internal logic. I don't understand it. How is he justifying this to himself?
The unanswerable aspect of that is that we see by the end of this very episode that Burt makes a plan to meet Irv behind his husband's back. So he's not redeemed at all, as his outside version of himself is not redeemed at all.
But you didn't touch on that contradiction, though, right? Where Fields is I remember this conversation 20 years ago. And then someone says, wait, the Severance program has only existed for 12 years.
12 years. Mm-hmm.
Burt does the thing where maybe you've had enough wine, right? There's something going on where the timelines are different publicly than they are perhaps realistically in this world.
A couple of things I wanted to circle back to because I forgot to bring up also is this is where the title Attila comes from.
Yes.
They call each other Hun, like honey, and they started calling each other Hun, H-O-N, like honey, short for honey. And then that became Hun, like Attila the Hun. It does speak to maybe at some point from Hun to Attila, they became more antagonistic towards each other. And maybe it's because of Burt's philandering. Really interesting scene where he says, it's about 20 years ago, I caught you with your Lumen workmate. And he was really surprised. Now, that doesn't sound like that. He caught a severed version of him with somebody else, because then why would he be in the same space at the same time, right? That wouldn't make any sense. So it seems like he worked for Lumen before the severed process occurred. It makes sense that that's the case, because when he asks him, what made you get severed? And it's like, well, this sermon I heard about severed people maybe having, clean slate souls. So you would assume that if that's being said in public, then the public knows about Severance. Therefore, the public story, which Severance started occurring about 12 years ago, that timeline makes sense, where he goes, oh, must have been 10 years ago. You're confused. But he didn't say, I saw you severed 20 years ago.
Right.
He said, I saw you hanging out with this Lumen person 20 years ago. So it seems like either Burt knew someone who worked at Lumen for a while, or maybe Burt worked at Lumen before the severance process.
Because it was something, I think the phrase was something like your partner at Lumen.
Your partner at Lumen,
like
yes.
That. So could read that a few different ways.
Exactly. And of course, Burt tells him, yes, of course, that must have been 10 years ago. I think you've had a little too much of this. And one way to read that is him saying like, oh, his memory gets foggy when he's drinking too much. Another version of it is, shut your mouth, you're saying too much when you drink.
Loose lips sink ships.
Exactly. Speaking of sinking ships, right? A lot of sinking ship references on this this show in general.
That's true. And I love how in response to that, Fields just keeps on drinking his wine.
He does.
Which is almost the same thing any spouse would do when the one says to the other, I think you've had enough to drink.
And then we get to the very end of the episode. Mark has decided to go through in his dingy basement, a little brain surgery, just to stick a syringe in my brain. Sure, no problem. Something starts to happen in his mind. He remembers having sex with Helly, which happened just earlier that day. And then, of course, that is flipping back and forth with him being close, face to face with Helena. So he's suddenly being like, oh my God. Basically, everything is collapsing onto him. Of course, he can't even take it all in. And then she's like, stay still. But he's making this revelation. At that moment, worst possible time, Devin shows up. Remember that time when they tried to synchronize him the first time and his hand was twitching? This time, that same hand seems to not function. He's not able to pick up his glass of water. He says, what's that smell? Which is, by the way, oftentimes people say they smell something bad before they have a stroke. So it's like he's
toast, isn't it? Sometimes toast.
And then collapses on the floor. And we had a question last week as to, well, obviously Devin doesn't know what's going on. Well, she does now, because Ragabi pops out of the basement and she's like, who are you? What's happening here?
Yes.
That's where we leave things. So next week, the episode is same director as this week. So probably a continuation of a lot of the themes we saw explored here.
Love that.
But Sona, the title of the next episode may be a troubling sign here.
Is it goat related?
No. It's Chick High Bardo. Do you know Chick High Bardo? You probably don't.
I don't.
Anyway, so I'll just read this from Wikipedia. The Chick High Bardo is the fourth Bardo in Tibetan Buddhism and the stage of death. It is also known as the Bardo of the moment of death. That does not bode well. More interesting, by the way, Sona, when I searched for this, is in this little mini article, it says what happens after this Bardo. What happens next is the soul becomes conscious and remembers their identity and attempts to return to the body.
Oh.
So A, is one of our characters going to die? That would be terrible, obviously. Like die for real. But more importantly, and maybe more realistically, is the soul trying to return to the body. If we have heard multiple times, like for example, Irv is dead, quote unquote, Innie Irv. What happens to these suppressed personalities? And do they gain awareness that they are, quote unquote, dead? For example, can you really retire your Innie? Or is there some aspect of it always trapped inside of the person? That's where my mind goes for all of this. All right, everybody. That's the end of the discussion of the episode. Thanks again.
Okay.
I'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you later.